All right, first thing is, I read your book, Socialism Seriously. What inspired you to write that?
All right, it's around 2014 when I start writing it, and so it's funny because, this is before Bernie's presidential run, and I remember someone even joking, like, maybe the title of the book wouldn't have changed if I had written it after he ran. It's almost like the way you pronounce it would. It's like when I wrote this book, it was like socialism. Like, seriously, like, come on, guys. And it's like a couple years later, it's like, socialism. Seriously. Like, it just become a much more common sense thing. My motivation at the time was, I guess, a little bit maybe anticipating what we saw with the popularity of Sanders. Was I saw tons of people, particularly young people, but not only young people, who were pretty openly in opposition to capitalism, at least as an idea or how it worked, but not really being very clear about what an alternative was, And some of those people would either consider themselves socialists or at least be open to it. But even among the many people who consider themselves, we've been sort of deprived of any understanding of, well, what does socialism mean, or at least what are the different things socialism can mean. Because when I wrote the book, I did try to make clear that, like, the version that I'm giving you in this book, which is Marxist, which is revolutionary, which thinks that things like the Russian Revolution were good things, but then thinks that the sort of dictatorships that emerged from it were bad things. I'm trying to make it clear, hey, look, you're going to find other versions of socialism that are different, but at least to give some people some more stuff to work with, and just to be kind of like just open some doors and maybe give some people some guidance about where else they can go to deepen their understanding, but at least start putting some content on, like, the very general idea that, like, there's got to be something better than capitalism, which is the way I felt. That's what I saw a lot around me, and I still see that around me now. But I think a couple years later, you got a lot more people who have become more pursued some of those ideas. So I think that's great.
Thanks for that.
I think it's all thanks to my book.
Kind of along those lines, with your book, and I'm seeing just more and more posting, more literature, more YouTube videos. Do you feel like we are or could in the near future reach a tipping point where this is no longer kind of a fringe thing, but this becomes mainstream and it takes over public discourse?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, because I guess that gets into questions like, right, what does a tipping point mean for something like this? Obviously, there's probably more than I guess tipping point implies there's sort of just one decisive turning point, but probably there's many. It's clearly the Sanders campaign was one of those in terms of, again, in my opinion, from what I saw as a socialist organizer doing work even before that, it wasn't so much that it converted millions of people to being socialists, but that it sort of connected millions of people who had privately considered themselves to be socialist, or at least socialist curious, to being like, oh my God, I'm not just this freak. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And so it had this kind of explosive effect in that way that, so almost like a coming out of the closet kind of thing, right? But so that's one tipping point, but obviously not the tipping point. So I think what's going to be curious is there's these dual things going on. There's quantity and there's quality, right? There's the quantity question of more people becoming socialists, or voting for socialist candidates or joining socialist organizations. Then there's the quality question of, well, how is that socialism getting defined, right? And it's a tricky balance, because while I think it's great that there's more and more, again, in elections and things like that, people running for local office saying, yeah, I'm a socialist, right? I mean, it's happening in Texas, it's happening everywhere. Then on the other hand, though, there's a danger of what that means getting so ephemeral or watered down or whatever you want to say, that it's just sort of like it almost becomes another synonym for liberal. Like, I'm just a liberal Democrat, I'm a socialist. So, you know, if you're, there are all these like Western European countries where there's not the same kind of like taboo. Someone saying they're a socialist doesn't mean they're not trying to cut your pension. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like in Greece.
Migrants from coming into the country. So I'm not saying that's where we're at now, but there is going to be these like, and part of that tension is going to be socialism. There is going to be a bit of tension between, well, we can get more people elected as socialists if we do kind of tamper down what it means, and you know, in that quality quantity thing, it's not all one or all the other. You know, that's the art of politics. So I'm almost dodging your question because I think there's so much, but there's so many variables to try to see. So I guess I do think there's gonna be tipping points or turns in terms of a real expansion of the term socialist. But then I think even within that, there's going to be interesting moments of what I'm hoping for is expansion of some of the most radical ideas of what that socialism means. You know.
Yeah, definitely. Something I've found along those lines in my experience is it seems like if you ask 10 different socialists to define socialism, you'll get 10 very different answers. It seems like socialism is less, at least in its ideal, is less top-down and more horizontally organized, trying to include the mass of people. Given that, how do you reach some kind of, maybe not consensus, but a broadly accepted definition of socialism that a lot of people can get behind, given that there's so many different views of what it should look like?
So first, I'm glad you framed that question in terms of the 10 different answers as a positive and not just a negative, because I do think sometimes people see that as like, oh, this is hopeless, and it's like, well, no, it means, right, we have, socialism is actually a pretty broad category when you're talking about like an alternative to capitalism, that there should be a lot of different ideas. I think it's going to be, it's not going to be consensus, but I generally think those kind of questions tend to, like, we don't have to create unanimity. Like life and politics has a way of posing certain questions that people have to figure out which way are they going to go to, So just one thing I'll lay out in the book Socialism Seriously, I try to, in one tiny chapter, I try to give a little rough outline of the evolution of the different wings of the socialist movement, right? And the broad, the first kind of major division is between what later becomes known as revolutionaries and reformists, and they were a lot more similar and in the same camp than maybe some of those words would imply, but it was really the Russian Revolution and other revolutions at the time that that in the moment, but certainly more afterwards, started to find more people, two different ideas of how we would get to socialism, whether it would primarily be through elections or whether it would primarily have to be beyond elections. That was one moment, and at different moments in time, either of those wings was stronger than the other. Do you know what I mean? And that's how this stuff gets determined. Later, of course, was the Russian Revolution degenerated and becomes this dictatorship. Even among the revolutionaries, you get this division between, very broadly, what's called Stalinists and what's called Trotskyists, right? Those who are sort of overall saying, no, this thing isn't perfect, but it needs to be defended, and those saying, no, it's crossed over to the point where it's actually doing far more harm than good.
Right.
That being and for most time, the folks who are the pro-Soviet Union within that camp were bigger. But my point is being that like history has a way of posing these questions, and then whichever you figure out what you stand on it, and you try to get your side to win the most support, and what I'm hoping is, so like for me as a socialist who I'm very much in the minority right now, I think, and a lot of my comrades in thinking that in this country we as hard as it is to break out of the two-party system, we're going to have to, you know what I mean? Because the Democratic Party is even though it allows us to run in local races, things like that, that it's never going to give up the actual donor class. Is never going to give up its power, and it's always going to be a bit of a dead end. That's a real minority position among the millions of people that are starting to consider themselves socialists in this country. And I can't just say, no, that's not so. I'm defining socialism this way. You got to get in my camp. It's like me and people who think like me have to do the work of trying to convince people, actually build alternatives to it. But it's also going to be knowing that things are going to come up in politics and history that are going to be turning points around that stuff, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, that kind of leads into my next question. Some people think that Rosa Luxemburg, definitively answered the question, reform or revolution, that, reform is basically dead and revolution is the only path. What do you see as a realistic path to socialism, and do you think that voting has any purpose, either pragmatically or symbolically, maybe not for Democrats or Republicans, but for either Greens or one of the socialist parties that get no attention? Is there any purpose in that?
Answer the second question, yes. Answer the first question, I think reforms are essential. And it's funny, I think it's really important to see the difference between reforms and reformism. And that word reformism is people are less familiar with. But and I think Rosa Luxemburg, I'm just going to confidently speak for Comrade Rosa and say that I think she would agree with what I'm about to say. But, going back to Marx for a second, Marx, he's one of the central dilemmas he feels like the socialist movement of his time has to face is he's saying on the one hand, socialism can't just be brought about from above by some heroic visionary, you know what I mean? It has to actually be created by the working class itself. But that's what socialism is about. That's why Marx he was fundamentally trying to introduce democracy into these pipe dreams of like utopian socialists and things like that. On the other hand, he understood very clearly this isn't about romanticizing workers and just saying, oh, these people are so noble. And it's like, no, we're all totally screwed up by growing up under capitalism, by being pitted against each other, by being inculcated with sexism and nationalism, you know what I mean, etc. And so it's not just saying like, oh, if tomorrow all the capitalists were sucked up by aliens and workers were running society, you'd have socialism. What Marx talked about, and I think this is really so much the key to what socialism is, that it's actually in the act of fighting for reforms that working people learn how to become organizers, learn how to become leaders, learn how to work together, learn how to disagree, learn how to organize meetings where you take votes and you sometimes win and you sometimes lose, but also develop within their own ranks leaders who are capable of either making incredible speeches or planning strategy. So the fight for reforms is both central because these fights are often a matter of life and death for many of us. You know what I mean? If you talk about winning things like Social Security or unemployment insurance or ending legal segregation or winning the right to abortion or marriage equality, you'd have to have no pulse to think that these reforms didn't matter. But just as importantly, from a revolutionary perspective, it's in the process of fighting for these things that actually ordinary people, working class people, can become fit to rule, was the phrase that Marx used. Now, just to say, so that's reform. So to me, in that sense, there's no contradiction between the fight for reforms and the fight for revolution. But reformism, which is what Luxemburg is really talking about in that pamphlet, Reform or Revolution, it is the politics that says that the only way, that the reforms are both an end in themselves, and for those people who do consider themselves socialists, who view the way we're going to get to socialism just by reform after reform after reform after reform, and pretty soon, look, hey, it's socialism. Like we've slowly ameliorated things. We've gotten people elected. We keep raising the minimum wage till it's, you know what I mean? Until workers actually control where they work, and that's something where the revolutionary counter to that will be no. See, the problem is that there is under capitalism, capitalists do rule. They do have power, and they're far too smart to allow us to just like keep cutting. I'm just gonna make a weird analogy that didn't work, but you know what I mean? To keep chipping away, and suddenly they're like, oh my God, what happened? Like, we lost capitalism. So that there has to be the fight for reforms. Also has to be combined with a perspective that what we're fighting for under socialism is ultimately can't just be won through those reforms.
Good. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but you know Slavoj Žižek?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read the collected works, but hit me.
Okay, he made some waves by endorsing Trump in the 2016 election, and a lot of socialists I know would call that philosophy accelerationism. You know, essentially, if we can have the worst possible brand of capitalism, then that will ignite a fire under, working people, and we'll get to socialism quicker. What do you think of that idea?
So I guess to me, I think that's so anathema to me. So on one basic level, right, it's like, Zizek's like a public intellectual, right? So one, he has an interest in just making waves and calling attention to himself. He's also not accountable to any movement or organizations. I have no idea how anybody actually building real work, a real organization would ever expect it to be able to win over a single immigrant or Muslim American after having endorsed Donald Trump. Like, what does that even mean? You know what I mean? It's like, hoping that enough of you get deported that things will get really, like, what the hell is that, right? But I think it's also from the when I mentioned before how Marx, the kind of socialism that he forged was about a socialism created by working class people themselves, and for socialists themselves to be part of those ranks, whether you yourself were born into a working class background or not, but not seeing socialists as these, in his time, it was these utopians who would put forth blueprints and try to get people to follow them and even convince rich people to do it. To me, like, that kind of accelerationism comes from a similar place where it's like socialists see themselves as like outside of society and just like hoping that they can write this. First of all, it's idle speculation because the socialists don't have the power to make Trump happen. It's like saying, hopefully this will happen. But the idea that you're so removed from the daily life and the daily struggle and you're just hoping that people's lives get worse so that then they rebel is that is not the kind of socialist I would want in any positions of leadership in a movement, because that, to me, it seems like a very short leap from, if that's your view of socialists, is sort of standing above stuff. That, to me, has a lot more in common with the dictatorships that call themselves socialists, but meanwhile totally stood over society and oppressed people and threw them in gulags.
Yeah.
Sorry to just to be blunt about it.
Yeah, definitely. Backing up a little bit, how did you become a socialist, and what does that ideology mean to you?
So I got bit by this radioactive spider. Right? So I became a socialist in the 90s when everything was stupid and very few people were thinking about this stuff. And for me, it happened. I guess basically I found myself being one of the few people I knew that was really disillusioned by the Bill Clinton years. And not that most people I knew loved Bill Clinton, but I found myself getting involved in particularly immigrants' rights activism. A lot of the attacks we see on immigrants today were beginning back then, starting in California, but also Bill Clinton actually passed one of the worst immigration bills that set the stage for a lot of this stuff. And I found that as I started, I happened to be, I was lucky enough that where I was going to school, like some of the people organizing the protests, whatever, they were socialists, they're part of the International Socialist Organization. And I did not consider myself a socialist at all at the time I started organizing with them, but I was pretty cynical about socialism. But I did appreciate their sort of combination of like, let's organize protests, but let's also have meetings to discuss the politics of immigration, like why the world shouldn't have borders and stuff like that, and just a range of topics. And so gradually for me, that's what sort of initially lit the spark. But then it was also then going through, really particularly, I gotta say, for some of the experiences of when Bill Clinton got reelected in 1996, he passed welfare reform, he passed this horrible immigration bill and a crime bill, all in order to get reelected, to move to the right and win these Republican votes. And just watching so many people who were really smart that I knew, they didn't love what he was doing, but they kind of defended it, like, well, it would be worse if the Republicans won. And by the way, it always is. Like, at the time the Republicans were led by Newt Gingrich, they were horrible. Like, no matter how bad the Democrats get, the Republicans always will figure out a way to be worse. That's how the two-party system works, right? They're not the same party. But it sort of had a profound influence on me, seeing how the lens of partisanship in the two-party system really distorted people's views. And meanwhile, they were all looking at me thinking, oh, you're getting so distorted by this socialism stuff. And I'm thinking, no, well, we all view things through different lenses, but I really felt confident that I was viewing what was happening in the country through such clearer eyes, because I wasn't masked by, like, are you a red state or a blue state kind of, you know what I mean? And everything colors what you think from that. So that's kind of what really got me going. I feel like the second part of your question was, what does socialism mean to me? Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's a big question. I guess. I mean, there's obviously there's socialism, like the society that we're all fighting for, and then there's socialism, like the movement right now, or what it means to be a socialist. And so I'll take that latter one, and if you were looking for the first one, you can tell me that. To me, being a socialist is first and foremost, it's about working alongside other comrades. Like, I don't know. You're probably in an organization, or if you're not in one, trying to figure out some kind of collective that you can be a part of, because it's not just about like some armchair gazing about what's wrong, but it's about being very much part of actively trying to figure out two different things. On the one hand, what is the bigger picture that we're trying to get to? You know what I mean? Like, in terms of this different society, but then how does that connect to right here, where I'm living, where we're at right now? That doesn't mean it has to be just something happening in your city, but like what, and specifically how to be involved in a fight, because it's really where, it's to me, when people are involved in protests and trying to make change, that suddenly the whole world opens up to them. I think it's Rosa Luxemburg's coming up a bunch. I think she's often credited with the quote, people, it's only when you start moving that you notice your chains. Wow, I just butchered that quote. But the point being, I've seen it time and time again when folks go on strike, people who've never really considered themselves activists before, just the act of their going against what you're supposed to be doing, literally by not working, and then often by seeing the distorted way that their strike is getting covered in the media, let's say, right? It starts clicking a lot of things, like, wait, well, what else is getting distorted in the media? You know what I mean? Like, and just the act of, like, going against some part of the system completely shifts people's, like, framework for looking at everything else. I'm not saying that everybody who goes on strike or protest suddenly becomes a radical, but a lot of them do it. So to me, being a socialist is about joining fights wherever you can, both because it's all about building that kind of solidarity and the community that from it, but also because it's in those fights that people want to talk about, like, oh, and why the hell does this happen? Why the hell does the world work like this? Stuff that normally when you're just going to work every day and paying taxes and just doing everything you're supposed to, you feel like, yeah, whatever. Like, I just got to keep going, you know?
Yeah. All right, this is my last question, and then I'll let you go. Can you tell me a little bit about your activism? And you mentioned some stuff in the 90s. Just how did that get started for you, and what did that look like? What does that look like for you today?
All right. Yeah. So, I've been active for around 20 years. And over that time, I've been involved in lots of different stuff. You know, I've been part of the International Socialist Organization for almost that whole time, and so my activism hasn't just been like, oh, I'm just going to do this or that. You know, it's part of collective decision making about what, you know, to be involved in. I'll just name a couple things, I guess, just to give folks a sense. I spent a number of years involved in immigrant rights work in different ways. I've also been, you know, more as I've become a writer, that's taken up more of my time. But building work in New York City and Queens, where I live, around some local cases trying to stop deportation. Sometimes we've won, sometimes we've not. And this is in the Obama years and in the Trump years, trying to connect each of those individual cases with building wider organizations, and always trying to build networks that could involve community members in, you know, helping to stop deportations of their neighbors. Individually, it's been really successful at times in terms of helping to stop deportations. But that broader goal has never quite happened, right? Of that vision of, can you build an ongoing, growing organization that involve, like, there's many people who, you know, don't want to see folks in their community get deported, but the process of building that kind of week in, week out organization where people show up at organizing meetings, that's been more a struggle. That's been one aspect of stuff I've done. I worked in Teamsters, in UPS for like around 5 years, and I was in Teamsters and involved in some of like the reform networks that were trying to make that union more of a fighting union, more of a democratic union. And I learned a lot through those experiences. You know, I learned a lot, mostly through losing, through making mistakes. But it gave me, you know, I think a sense of some perspective and patience around, you know, some of the long-term nature of that work, but also some of how unpredictable it can be, where you as one of the few kind of like workplace militants or whatever can be banging your head for months or even years around an issue. And it's something you never anticipated being a thing to galvanize people, and suddenly you're nervous because you're saying, oh, guys, I don't know if we could do this, because you've been so accustomed to like months or years of defeat, and suddenly people around you are like, no, we like, and having to adjust very quickly to being like, oh, wait, this is a new moment. Like, I have to be able to shed some of the conservatism that I've accrued just from having to like not get fired for the last couple of years being an activist, you know. So that's something I've learned a lot about too. And then the last thing I would say is, during the height of the Iraq War, I think everybody was an anti-war activist first and foremost. You know, like, that was what dominated during the Bush years. A lot of work people did, and that was both going to the big protests, but if you organized on campus, it meant when military recruiters showed up, trying to chase them off. And by chase them off, what I mean would be, you know, you set up your own protest right beside them and just make it, you know, just, they got free speech, you got free speech, but it's making it much harder for them to, you know, trick people into giving up their college education and going to the military, which they see what they're trying to do. Any number of other stuff like that. Now that kind of work, I think everyone's trying to figure out, this country's always at war, but what does it mean? Like, but obviously there's not really an anti-war movement, because it's at this sort of, you know, this country's always in low-level war in like 30 different countries at the same time. You know?
Yeah.
And that's a challenge that I think none of us have really figured out. So anyway, that's a sampling of some of the activism.
That's awesome. Well, that's all the questions I've got. Do you have anything you want to close us out with?
I probably we should, right? I need some catchphrase. My last name is Cat. No, I'm just good luck with this pod. It sounds like a fun idea.
Awesome. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate you coming on and having a conversation with me.